The Measure of Quiet Water. Episode 7. An Evening for Every Branch. By the time the western wall of Andhra began to turn honey-colored, 7 small bells lay in a row on the cool sill of Amara Day's survey house. They were not alike. One had a dark wooden handle polished by many hands. Another wore a loop of red cord, and the smallest was made from a shallow brass cup that gave a surprisingly certain note. Amara had tested each of them after the midday rest. She had listened from the lane, from Mint Bend, and from the first turn above the square. Then she had put them back in their row and resisted testing them again. Beside the bells lay 6 local branch cards cut from stiff cream paper and marked in charcoal and blue pencil, with Amara's distinct coordinator card set crosswise below them. Each local card named a place, a starting condition, the range that would count as balanced, and the signal to send when the local reading held steady. Nothing on them said which hand should lift a gate, which foot should stand on which stone, or how many breaths a person ought to wait before deciding that a surface had settled. Those details had been on Amara's first version. She had copied them out neatly that morning, looked at the close black rows, and understood that she had made 6 sets of instructions for becoming Amara. She had turned the cards over and begun again. Now the new cards left broad white spaces around 4 useful lines. At Cloud Step Spring, Leela would confirm that the settling bowl stayed between its 2 old line marks. At the 3-lip divide, Amara would hold the head flow and listen for all branch signals. Nico would compare the timing board at Mint Bend with the fill mark at Hearth Cistern. Tomas would attend the household overflow and the central lower run. Aaron would read Fennel Reach and Lavender End. Mira would observe the reed resting pool and carry any reports that could not be heard cleanly. Suri, who had volunteered before Amara had decided there was a role to volunteer for, would keep the square bell, note ordinary household draws, and make sure nobody mistook an empty stomach for an engineering problem. The practical work was familiar in pieces. Once each year, near the end of the gentler season, the village tested the full water network in one continuous cycle. They checked the spring's steady supply, the 3 principal divisions, the household cistern, the garden turns, and the final resting pool. Most weeks, each neighbor knew the nearby water better than anyone walking down from above could know it. The annual test was different only because all those local understandings had to agree at once. Amara had coordinated the previous 3 tests by walking nearly every channel herself. Each had been completed accurately. Each had also ended after dark, with Amara carrying a cold piece of supper home and remembering almost none of its taste. A broom whispered over paving outside. The scent of fennel and bread moved through the open window before Suri appeared at the door with a covered basket on one hip. "You have made the bells look as if they are awaiting judgment," Suri said. "They are awaiting distribution." "That is kinder." Suri set the basket on the long table. Beneath the cloth were 2 round time loaves, a row of small fennel rolls, mild cheese wrapped in leaves, and a jar of chopped herbs shining in oil. Amara looked at the quantity. "This is more than a test meal." "It is exactly a test meal. It is exactly a test meal. If the channels fail completely, we will have bread. If they perform beautifully, we will have bread. I appreciate a plan with reliable boundaries." Amara smiled and handed her the square card. "You are noting draws from Hearth Cistern. Buckets, pitchers, wash basins, anything more than a cup. Ring once when Tomas confirms the fill mark. Ring twice if a draw changes it before the next comparison." Suri read both sides, though the back was blank. "And if a child fills a cup? Ordinary use. No need to note it. If Mira fills a teapot large enough to serve the square, Mira will tell you whether it is a cup or an event. Good. Outcomes, not philosophy." Suri slipped the card into the pocket of her apron. "I can do this without knowing how you would hold the pencil." The words were lightly said, but they landed where Amara could use them. She tied the red cord bell to Surrey's basket handle. The others arrived by the upper lane in loose succession. Thomas came first with a measuring rod over one shoulder, and pale stone dust still settled in the creases of his hands. Mira followed with 2 stoppered tea jars and a bundle of cups that clicked softly in a cloth bag. Aaron brought no tool except his pruning knife and a strip of woven reed marked at finger-width intervals. Nico hurried the last few steps, then made himself slow down before entering, a habit so visible that Leela, arriving behind him, raised one eyebrow. "I was not late," Nico said. "No one suggested it," Leela replied. "Your eyebrow did. My eyebrow was observing your excellent arrival." Their voices settled around the table, through the back door. The listening channel beside the house kept up its narrow, even murmur. Amara poured spring water into cups and waited until everyone had found a place. She had put the rolled network map on the table in case it was needed, but she left it rolled. "The full test will take 1 baseline round and 1 final round," she said. "Between them we will adjust only what the reports show needs adjustment. The acceptable ranges are on your cards. You each choose how to reach and hold them in your section." Nico looked down at his card, then up. "If my timing and Thomas's mark disagree, report both. Do not correct either one until we compare their moment in the cycle." "And at lavender end?" Aaron asked. "The useful flow should cross the second reed mark without flooding the old lavender roots. The resting pool should show a continuous inlet, but it need not be deep. You know the lower beds. Set them as you judge best." Aaron rubbed the edge of the woven strip with his thumb and nodded once. Leela read aloud from her card. "Cloud step spring. Bow between white marks. Head channel clear. First bell after a steady count of 20. Am I allowed to count at my own speed?" "Within reason." "Then I will resist composing a very long song." The group laughed, and something in Amara's shoulders eased. She showed them the signal sequence without adding a lecture. 1 bell from the spring meant the source was steady. The 3-lip divide would answer with 1 note to begin release. The Eastern Gardens, Central Homes, and Western Gardens would each answer when their first readings were usable. 2 quick notes meant a temporary variation or an ordinary interruption, not an alarm. 3 slow notes meant stop and hold the present settings while someone carried a spoken report. They did not expect to need 3. Mira lifted the smallest bell. "This one sounds farther than it looks. It is for the resting pool. The lower air carries upward in the evening. And if it does not, bring the card to the square. We are testing communication too, that we needn't turn it into another ceremony." They took the cards and bells. Tomas chose the plain iron bell because he said it sounded like a spoon against a mixing bowl, and therefore could not make him nervous. Leela took the wooden-handled one. Aaron tied his to a belt loop. Nico tucked his card carefully inside a thin writing board, protecting it from spray. Mira put hers in the same bag as the cups, and promised not to pour tea over the annual record. Amara finally unrolled the map. It showed the water paths in blue and the terraces in soft blocks of gray, green, and faded violet. At its center, the 3-lip divide looked like the simple thing it was: 1 approach and 3 departures cut into a broad limestone table. On a map, no distance had heat, stairs, loose gravel, neighbors, or the temptation to change a gate while passing it. Amara placed 1 finger on the divide. "I will remain here for the baseline unless a stop signal is sent. During the final round, I will remain here through the entire cycle. Reports come to me. I do not come looking for reports." Thomas leaned over the map. "Shall we write that on your card?" Amara turned her own card around. In Surrey's square hand, written some time while Amara had been speaking, were the words "Stay at the Divig." "It appears to be covered," Amara said. They left the survey house together and separated at the first lane. Leela and Nico climbed toward the spring. Leela for the source and Nico to begin his timing at Mint Bend on the descent. Thomas and Surrey went toward the square. Mira and Aaron followed the western path until one would turn down through the homes and the other continue toward the lower terraces. Amara walked alone toward the three-lip divide. The late afternoon warmth remained in the white walls, but shadows had begun to stretch across the narrow path. Rosemary brushed her skirt at one bend. Somewhere below, Surrey's bakehouse door shut with a familiar wooden thump. The whole village seemed neither expectant nor solemn. A woman folded a rug over a courtyard rail. Two children carried an empty blue bucket between them, pausing to examine a beetle on the handle. The annual test belonged inside ordinary evening, as water did. At the divide, Amara laid her cart on a dry stone and set the central bell beside it. She checked the three lips once. The eastern lip was open to the charcoal notch Leela had used all week. The central lip sat a hair below its summer mark to account for the cooling cistern. The western lip held the patient opening Aaron preferred for Fennel Reach. Amara touched each gate handle, not to move it, but to know that it was seated. Then she sat on the low upstream wall. Cloud step water crossed the flat measure in a clear, ankle-deep sheet and divided. The three notes differed: a quick, bright ripple eastward, a quieter hollow run toward the homes, and a broad, low whisper west. She could identify them separately. The work of the evening was to let them continue together. Far uphill, a bell had not yet rung. Amara rested both palms on the cooling stone and waited for someone else to decide when the system was ready. Each. HE07H01 starty. A small bell rang uphill, then another answered far below. The first note came from Cloudstep Spring, clear and rounded in the open evening air. Leela had watched the settling bowl hold between its two white marks and had counted her chosen 20 before sending the signal. Amara answered from the three-lip divide with one firm stroke. She lifted the eastern, central, and western gates, only to the starting marks already agreed upon, then set the bell down. Water changed its voice over all three stone lips. For several breaths there was only the nearby rush. Then Tomas's plain iron bell sounded from Hearth's cistern, its homely note rising between the roofs. From Saffron Steps came Nico's quick reply, relayed for the upper gardens before he continued down to Mint Bend. Farther west, Aaron rang once from Fennel Reach. Last came the surprising brass clarity of Mira's bell at the reed resting pool. Between the notes, Amara heard each branch settle and waited without leaning toward its path. The replies had traveled out of sight along separate branches, yet they arrived in order: Spring, Divide, Upper Gardens, Homes, Western Reach, Resting Pool. Every section had received water on time. Distant voices followed the notes, too soft to make out his words, and Amara heard the village acknowledging the same continuous flow. Ithoke S4E07, H01. Ind. She marked the times on her card. There was no need for them to match the previous year's figures to the breath. The spring was slightly fuller this season, the time beds had been widened, and 3 households now drew from the east face of Hearth Cistern instead of the north. Balance meant that the present network served its present uses within the ranges everyone had agreed to. Nico's second signal came from Mint Bend. One note, a pause, then one note again. His card defined that pattern as baseline recorded, proceeding downhill. Amara pictured him setting the little floating cedar chip at the upper scratch, following it around the shaded curve, and noting its time at the lower scratch. She did not picture where he placed his feet. That was not part of the result. At the divide, the central branch deepened by the width of a fingernail as Hearth Cistern accepted its first fill. Amara crouched, held the end of her measuring strip at the dry reference line, and wrote down the depth. The western branch kept its low note. A pale leaf turned once at the lip and went on toward Fennel Reach. From the upper eastern path, Leela called, "Spring steady, head bowl clear." Her voice carried better than Amara expected. Amara raised a hand, though Leela could not yet see her around the bend. "Received," she called back. Leela soon appeared above the divide, walking at the measured pace of someone who knew the water behind her would not improve through hurry. She carried her branch cart under one arm and the bell loosely in one hand. "The bowl is near the upper mark," she said. "But it remained there through my count and through the release. The first time gate is taking cleanly. I marked the bed edge and will ring if it darkens past the stake." Amara looked toward the eastern path. "It would take less than 3 minutes to go see the stake." "Within your range?" she asked. "Comfortably. The rosemary bed is thirstier than the thyme, so I gave its firstier than the thyme, so I gave its first gate a little more, and the lower sage a little less. The branch itself remains at its card mark." "Good. Record the local settings in the white space." Leela sat at the opposite end of the wall and wrote. Her notation consisted of 3 plant names, 2 arrows, and a small drawing that might have been a leaf or a bird. Amara's own notation would have used gate fractions. She could still understand Leela's. "You are looking at my drawing," Leela said. "I am verifying that it is a drawing. It is rosemary leaning toward water. Future historians will be grateful." The iron bell rang twice from below. Amara stood. 2 notes meant a variation, not a stop. She listened for a third. None came. The central branch continued without a sudden rise or fall. "Tomas will report," Leela said. Yes. Amara remained standing until she noticed that remaining standing was a kind of beginning. She sat again. Mira arrived first, climbing from the square rather than from the resting pool. She had left her bell with Aaron's niece at lavender end, and carried 2 of the cups filled with pale mint tea. "The resting pool inlet is continuous," she reported. "The first reed is wet, the second is dry, and the surface has begun its usual circle at the south edge. Aaron says the lavender branch is crossing his lower mark a little later than last year, but it is crossing. He is watching one uneven run beside the old purple bed." "How much later?" he said. "Less time than it takes Mira to persuade a cautious person to drink tea." Amara accepted a cup. "That is not a standard unit. I asked for clarity." He added, "About half a cup." Leela took the other cup. "At Mira's rate or mine, he may be forced to use numbers when he comes up." The tea was still warm. Bruised mint rose with the steam, and the cup warmed Amara's fingers where the stone wall had cooled them. She wrote, "Lavender arrival slightly late. Flow continuous. Lower pool normal. Usable," she thought. The report was usable. Thomas came up the central path carrying his measuring rod like a walking stick. Nico followed a few paces behind, reading his timing board as he walked, and nearly passing Thomas when the mason stopped to let a pair of neighbors cross with washing baskets. "The cistern reached its baseline mark," Thomas said. Then it fell a small thumb before the comparison interval finished. "I rang twice because Surrey recorded no large draw at that moment. The overflow returned, but 9 breaths later than the card's range." Nico held up his board. "And Mint Bend ran 8 breaths faster than the usual comparison. That is 1 variation above and 1 below." Amara put down her cup. The easy impulse was already laying out a route. Central path to the cistern. East turn to Mint Bend, perhaps back to the divide to compare the lip. She looked at the 3 water voices in front of her instead. "Tell me what you observed, not what you think I should inspect," she said. Tomas rested the rod against the wall. The cistern inlet was clear. The float rose without sticking. When the level fell, the inlet did not change note. The overflow lip remained wet, then dried for those 9 breaths, then ran again. "Any bucket sounds?" "One small one from the west steps, before Surrey's second look. Nothing large enough to explain a thumb." "Nico?" "My cedar chip traveled cleanly. No leaves at the bend, no garden gate opened while I watched. The branch seemed slightly deeper at the first scratch, then ordinary at the second. I timed twice." The second run was only 4 breaths fast. Amara drew 2 lines on her card, one for time and one for depth. The variations could be connected. A brief larger release through Mint Bend might have reached the cistern early, filled it, and passed on. But it would not explain the later drop unless a draw occurred, or the central lip at the divide might be giving a pulse when the other gates changed. Yet she had been sitting beside it. Its note had remained steady. Was the household feed gate in its normal position? Leela asked. Tomas nodded. At the old chisel mark. Normal according to the stone, or normal according to Sari? Mira asked. I did not ask the stone about breakfast, Tomas said. So the chisel mark. Amara appreciated the question. Household use rarely followed a testing schedule merely because the annual record had a tidy grid. We will not adjust yet. Nico, compare your next Mint Bend timing to the actual cistern fill mark, not to last year's interval. Thomas, watch the west draw steps as well as the float. Suri's card should tell us any ordinary use she sees. Do you want me to close the feed for the comparison? Thomas asked. No. We are testing the village's water, not an empty model of it. Leave household use open. Nico turned his pencil around between his fingers. So my outcome is a paired time. Start when the divide rings, mark Mint Bend, then mark when hearth reaches the line. Yes, report both even if one looks wrong. And if the first looks wrong but the second explains it, then you will have brought us an explanation. He nodded, visibly pleased by the shape of the responsibility. He and Damas went back down together. Mira took the empty cups and followed as far as the square. Leela returned toward Saffron Steps to collect the garden baseline. Amara remained with the divide. The western water had changed pitch slightly, a roughness under the low whisper. She leaned close. A sprig of thyme, probably washed from an upper basket, had caught against the side of the lip. The water passed around it freely. She could lift it out in one motion. Instead, she watched. The sprig loosened, turned lengthwise, and slipped through. On the dry edge of her card, she wrote the eastern depth, central depth, and western depth. Then she added what the reports had already established: source steady. All branches received. Household variation temporary. Lower arrival late, but continuous. 2 minor variations, neither large enough to stop the test. The sun lowered until its reflection lay in a bright strip across the upstream sheet. Each ripple broke the light and remade it. Amara heard neighbors calling from terrace to terrace, not for her but to exchange their local numbers. At Saffron Steps, Leela called out the darkened soil mark. Near the square, Suri called something about a blue bucket. Aaron's voice rose from far below, answered by Mira. The reports came in different styles. Leela drew plants. Tomas measured in thumbs and then translated them into marks. Mira carried comparisons shaped like cups. Aaron trusted a reed strip and the dark line in soil. Nico counted breaths with great care. Suri kept a household list that probably included the purpose of every bucket, whether Amara needed it or not. Together, they described one network. When the next double note came from Hearth Cistern, Amara heard no uncertainty in it. It announced a variation to be understood. It did not ask her to take over. Nico reached the divide with his board held flat in both hands. He had climbed quickly enough for color to rise in his cheeks, but he stopped below the water table and took one full breath before speaking. Mint Bend was 6 breaths fast from the release signal, he said. Hearth Cistern reached the fill line within range. Then the level fell at the same moment the west step household pipe sounded. Tomas saw no one at the steps, but Suri rang twice and is coming with her card. So the quick bend did not make the cistern early, Amara said. No, the central run below the bend took longer than usual. Not blocked, just full along the edges. It balanced the time. Nico had drawn a clean sequence across his card. Divide bell. Upper scratch. Lower scratch. Cistern mark. Level change. Beneath it he had added the depth of the branch at each point. Amara could see his original expectation in a faint erased line. He had corrected the line instead of the water. That is a good comparison, she said. He glanced down, pleased and trying not to show it. The numbers only became useful together. They often do. Footsteps approached around the central turn. Amara waited with Nico's timing board open beside the cistern readings. OKS 4E07HO starred. One branch reading appeared wrong just as a household bucket was lifted. At Hearthcistern, Tomas had watched the float fall a thumb below its expected mark, while Nico's timing from Mint Bend ran fast. The annual test compared such temporary measurements across the network, and together these two seemed to call for a correction. Now the blue bucket and Suri's household card supplied the missing part of the sequence. The draw began through the bakehouse pipe, she explained. I opened it before the signal, but the long pipe did not deliver until the cistern reached its mark. This bucket is exactly one kneading trough and one rinsing cup. Nico set his timing board beside her record. The pipe's delayed delivery matched the falling float. Mint Bend had run fast. The fuller lower channel had softened that gain, and the ordinary household draw had caused the brief drop. Amara crossed out the correction she had not made. Then the cistern branch stays where it is, Thomas smiled. A very accurately washed trough. No gate needed changing. The recorded water draw explained the variation before anyone disturbed a balanced branch, and the test continued with the bakehouse pipe left open. Smock. Icux. 4E07H02END. Suri set down the bucket. I did not see the water leave because I was covering the dough. I heard the pipe, marked the draw, and rang when the bucket filled. Your signal crossed mine on the air. That is why the first report had no recorded draw, Tomas said. The pipe had begun, but the bucket had not. Amara looked from Suri's blocky notation to Nico's sequence, and Tomas's smaller mark beside the float depth. None of the three records would have explained the change alone. The system included the length of a household pipe and the time between turning a handle and hearing water strike a bucket. It included dough resting under cloth. It included the fact that Suri listened while her hands were occupied. Keep the draw on the annual sheet, Amara said. Not as an exception, as part of the condition under which the branch passed. Household allocation verified by bread, Suri said. At last, a formal recognition of the bakehouse. The bakehouse has never lacked recognition, Leela said as she returned from the east. Sometimes we can smell its importance from the spring. She handed Amara the eastern card. All three upper garden beds were within their soil-darkening ranges. The rosemary had taken slightly more of the first release, as Leela expected, and the sage edge had reached its marker 2 minutes later without any local flooding. That leaves lavender end, Amara said. Aaron's bell sounded once from the western lower path, followed after a pause by Mira's brighter bell. A few minutes later, Aaron climbed into view with his reed strip tucked behind one ear. Mira walked beside him carrying the pool card. The resting pool is exactly unexciting, Mira said. Continuous inlet, both planted edges calm, no clouding. Aaron took the reed strip from behind his ear and laid it across Amara's card. A wet line darkened the lower half. Lavender end crossed the second mark, but the old purple bed took too much of the edge flow at first. I checked the little lip above it. The left corner has settled since spring. Not broken. It only favors that bed by about this much. He placed his thumbnail against less than a finger's width on the strip. What setting do you want for the final round? Amara asked. Aaron considered. A clay shim under the left of the lip, thin as two folded leaves. That will send a little more along the straight run. Or I can lower the right pebble and get nearly the same outcome. The shim will be easier to record and secure. Amara knew the lip. It was a palm-wide piece of old limestone set where fennel reach divided between lavender end's two longest beds. She could have specified a thickness in parts of a finger and an angle relative to the terrace wall. Aaron had watched the soil receive the water. His proposed outcome was clear. Use the shim you judge will bring both runs across their first marks together, she said. Do not change the main western gate. I had no wish to walk all the way back up and change it, Aaron replied. A principled local decision, Tomas said. A hill-shaped one. They gathered around the divide while Aaron cut a small clay piece from the damp plug Tomas kept wrapped around the end of his measuring rod. He pressed it between thumb and palm, judging thickness by feel. Then he laid it on the dry wall for everyone to see. 2 folded leaves, Nico said. 2 leaves after a modest lunch, Aaron corrected. Amara almost asked him to measure it against her strip. The question reached the back of her teeth. She looked instead at the marked reed, showing the desired lower outcome. Bring back the final wet marks, she said. I will. Aaron and Mira headed downhill to place the shim. Suri took the empty bucket toward the bakehouse and promised not to produce another delayed trough without ringing. Tomas returned to the cistern to reset the float observation, and Nico went with him to prepare the paired timing. Leela remained for a moment, drinking the last cool mouthful from her cup. One small lip, she said. One small lip. You used to look disappointed when a whole system test found so little to repair. I did not. Leela waited. I may have looked insufficiently occupied, Amara amended. A grave condition. Amara folded the baseline cards beneath a smooth stone. The test had done what it was meant to do. It had found the difference between a temporary reading and a setting that needed adjustment. It had verified the household allocation while ordinary water was being used. It had shown the garden branches reaching their markers. There was nothing disappointing in the absence of unnecessary work. They walked 10 paces upstream together to check the approach from Cloudstep Spring. The water reflected the sunset so strongly that its clear surface looked copper. Leela crouched and put 2 fingers against the channel wall. Cooling, she said. The stone had begun to release the day's warmth. Amara touched it beside her. A narrow band at the waterline was cold. Above it, the limestone held a gentle heat. The source may rise a fraction as the air cools, Amara said. It usually does. My card allows it. Yes. Leela stood. Then I will manage my terrifying fraction. She returned uphill for the final source check. Amara went back to the divide and read all the cards once. The baseline had identified 2 variations. The central discrepancy, now explained by an ordinary household draw, and the uneven lower distribution, now reduced to 1 local lip setting. Nothing else needed correction. When Aaron's distant bell rang twice and then once, Mira relayed the message from halfway up. Shim placed, both dry channels ready for the final release. Amara wrote the final round limits on her card. Source between marks. Eastern beds within stakes. Hearth cistern to fill mark while household feed remained open. Western lower runs to cross first markers together. Lavender end to reach the second read. Resting pool inlet continuous. The outcomes fit in 6 lines. Above the village, Cloudstep Spring continued to send water into the approach. Below, neighbors took their places within the responsibilities they had already bounded for themselves. Amara set the central bell on the stone and waited for Leela's signal. The first preparation note traveled down from the spring as the sun touched the sea haze beyond Lavender End. Amara answered with 2 measured strokes, the signal for every section to set its local branch and hold. She did not touch the 3 principal gates yet. Around her, the divide gathered water behind its lips. It did not gather much. The upstream sheet deepened perhaps half a finger, but its sound became rounder, less broken. Amara checked the approach mark, made 1 notation and put the pencil down. The final test required a full cycle held steady. Once begun, no one was to improve a passing reading merely because another setting looked elegant. From the east came a faint wooden knock, as Leela seated a guarding gate. From below came Thomas's iron bell, one low note confirming the cistern float was reset. A voice at the square repeated the signal for someone behind a wall. Far west, the lower branch went briefly quiet while Aaron placed his adjusted lip and returned the small gates to their start marks. Mira's brass bell sounded last. Amara lifted all 3 gates to the agreed openings. The water entered the branches with a smooth, simultaneous change of pitch. She rang once to begin the timed cycle. Her task now was to hold the shared boundary. She watched the approach, the 3 depths, and the color of the water. She listened for the signals. Everything else belonged to the sections beyond her sight. That understanding did not make the paths disappear from her mind. The eastern path waited a few steps away, climbing past thyme and rosemary. The central path curved downhill to Mint Bend and Hearthkistern. The western path crossed an easy shelf before beginning its long descent. From where she stood, Amara could take 3 minutes to inspect the first eastern stake, 5 to reach the cistern, or 7 to see the top of Fennel Reach. She had walked each distance so often that her body seemed to know how long to lean toward it. Leela's bell rang once, upper source steady. Nico's reply came from the eastern timing point. First garden branch within range. Amara wrote both, then looked up, instead of down a path. At the western lip, a wavering thread of foam appeared and vanished. The depth held. At the central lip, reflected sunlight had faded from copper to rose. The stone beneath Amara's palm cooled as the air moved downslope. The first long interval began. During it, the head release had to remain unchanged while local branches took their allocations. It was the portion of the annual test Amara had once considered too important to observe from only one place. And earlier she had asked Thomas to mind the divide while she went down to check the cistern, then asked Leela to watch it while she crossed to the western gardens. Each exchange had introduced a different hand at the most consequential gates. She had collected more observations and created less continuity. This evening she stayed. Thomas rang once from Hearthcistern. The fill mark had been reached within the range. A moment later, Surrey's red cord bell answered once from the square. Household feed open. No unrecorded large draw. Nico's 2-note timing signal followed. Not a variation this time, but the paired mark agreed during the discovery. Amara entered the times. Mint Bend remained slightly quicker than last year's annual figure, yet the cistern reached its proper level at the proper point in this cycle. No number needed to be made lonely by comparison with a vanished season. Voices drifted upward. East step wet, someone called. Received, Leela answered. Then, Thomas, overflow begun. Surrey called, household line clear. The reports were not addressed to Amara, and she did not turn them into questions. Neighbors confirmed one another within their sections. Her own card asked only whether the shared system stayed inside its boundaries. The eastern depth dipped by a sliver as the rosemary bed opened. It remained above the lower charcoal line. Amara watched it settle and made no correction. Soon Leela's bell rang once again. The card's signal that all 3 upper beds had received their set portions. The eastern branch passed. The western signal took longer. It was supposed to. Fennel Reach rewarded a patient release, and Lavender End was the farthest useful branch. Amara listened past the nearer central water for the lower note. She heard a laugh from the square, a cupboard door, the scrape of a bench. Bread and fennel seed moved uphill on the breeze. The smell made the remaining test interval feel less like an empty duration and more like part of the evening everyone was already entering. Mira rang twice from the lower terraces. Amara's hands stopped above the card. 2 notes at that stage meant a local comparison, not a failure. She waited. Aaron's bell answered once, then Mira rang once. The sequence was the one they had improvised on their section card. First lower run at its mark. Second lower run at its mark. Resting pool receiving. Both branches had arrived separately, close enough in time to satisfy Aaron's outcome, and the water beyond them remained continuous. Amara noted the sequence. She did not go to see the clay shim. The full cycle hold still remained. Each section would keep its settings while a final measure passed from the source to the resting pool. The village used a song-length interval for ordinary rotations, but for the annual record they used the travel of a marked float through the upper measure and a sand glass at Hearth Kistern. Leela would release the float. Tomas would turn the glass. Their final signals had to agree within the wide margin on the cards. At Cloudstep Spring, the wooden-handled bell rang 3 quick, bright notes. Not the 3 slow stop notes, but the familiar float release pattern. Amara saw the marker arrive less than a minute later, a disc of pale cork with a blue edge, moving in the center of the approach. It turned gently as it crossed the reflected sky. She knelt near the central lip, but kept her hands on the dry stone. The marker passed the reference scratch. She rang once. Water carried it toward a shallow catching grate before the divide. It bumped the first reed, slipped sideways and lodged for half a breath against a wet leaf. Amara felt the old instinct rise. Free it, restart. Protect the comparison. The leaf shifted under the flow. The disc passed through the grate and settled in the little catching bowl exactly as designed. She rang once more. Below, Tomas turned the sandglass. The system held. Upper water entered. 3 shares left. The gates did not require hands to remain true. Amara stood at the center and listened to the separate notes settle into something she could no longer divide without concentrating. Nico came into view on the central path, then stopped at the last turn below her. His card required him to remain between Mint Bend and the cistern during the hold, able to hear both signals. He lifted one hand in greeting but did not climb farther. Amara returned the gesture. The first temptation had been to walk every path. A subtler one was to call down and ask for details before they were due. She did not call. Nico leaned against the terrace wall and listened. When the cistern's overflow note changed, he looked downhill, checked his board and wrote. His responsibility had edges. Within them he did not need Amara's permission to observe or decide. At the east, Leela moved between the beds. Amara could see only the top of her straw hat at intervals above the rosemary. Once, the hat remained still for so long that Amara imagined Leela had found a gate displaced. Then Leela stood, checked the soil against her marked stake, and continued. No variation signal came. The final sunlight left the divide. Blue shade collected first in the narrow channels, then over the pale terrace walls. Water held the last brightness longer than stone did. Tomas's bell rang once, half interval, cistern steady. Surrey's rang once, household allocation normal. Aaron's sounded far below, lavender second mark reached. Mara's brass answer rose from the resting pool, inlet continuous. Amara read the column on her card. Every current value stood between its 2 acceptable boundaries. She did not yet mark the test complete. The full sand interval had to finish, the gardens had to close their measured turns, and the final resting flow had to remain clear after the gates shifted back to evening allocations. She breathed with the water for a time, not counting. The divide had its own balance beneath the numbers. When the western branch took slightly more over a ripple, the next ripple favored the central lip. Small changes moved through the common sheet and averaged themselves before anyone became a need. From the square, Surrey began ringing a slow series unrelated to the formal code. 1, pause, 1, pause, 1, 1. Amara frowned until she heard Surrey call, not a signal. I am persuading children to stop testing the supper bell. Thomas called back, is the persuasion within range? Results are pending. Laughter moved up the terraces. Amara wrote nothing about it on the annual card. At last the iron bell gave 2 firm notes. The sand had run through. Nico checked the paired time and raised his hand. Leela signaled the upper hold complete. Aaron and Mira answered from below, their bells separated by the travel time they had already established. Amara closed the 3 main gates only as far as the evening allocation marks. The water sounds softened but did not cease. Each section now had to return its local gates to ordinary use and take one closing reading. She waited at the divide. The closing readings did not all return immediately. That interval belonged to the test as much as the louder release had. Local keepers needed time to see whether reduced evening flows settled cleanly after the full cycle. Amara laid the 3 passing cards side by side and kept the principal lips at their evening marks. Nico returned down the central path to listen at Mint Bend. Tomas followed only as far as the cistern, where he leaned the measuring rod against the float housing and waited for its small wooden pointer to stop moving. Leela remained near Amara until the eastern depth reached a stable line, then walked up toward the sage bed without asking Amara to mind anything beyond the divide. Aaron and Mira were still below. Their final confirmation required the longest travel because the lower channels had to empty from test depth into ordinary depth without leaving one lavender run dry. The clay shim had corrected the distribution during the fuller release. Now it had to remain useful when less water crossed the lip. Amara could not see that small division from above. She could only hear the main western run and wait for the people beside it to judge the result. Mira came along the western shelf carrying her empty cup bag. She stopped on the far side of the channel and looked at Amara, then at the cards. "Are we still holding our kitchen branch?" she asked. Amara checked the time. The kitchen branch belonged within Aaron's section, and his outcome card allowed household use to resume after Lavender N's first closing signal. That signal had not come until Aaron rings once, Amara said. "Then you may take the ordinary evening amount." Mira nodded. She did not ask what width the gate should be. Aaron marked the ordinary setting at the second nick on the handle. "Use the mark you and Aaron set." Mira rested her cup bag on the wall and waited. The fennel beds below gave the air a sweet green scent. After a little while, the lower bell sounded once. "There it is," Mira said. She went down the side stair. Amara heard a wooden gate settle. Then a narrow new thread joined the western water. Its draw lowered the depth at the divide by less than the thickness of the pencil line. The branch remained within range. Mira returned with damp fingers and lifted her cup bag. "Second nick. The basin is filling." "Thank you. I will close it when the shadow reaches the lower step." She went back down toward the resting pool. The kitchen branch did not appear separately on the annual sheet. It was one of the small household and garden uses gathered under the Western allocation. Yet the full system was balanced only if those ordinary marks worked after the formal release. Amara added a small notation beneath Aaron's result. Western kitchen branch resumed its second nick. Western main held. From above came the rub of Leela's sandals on stone. She did not ring, because the closing garden confirmation was meant to arrive only after all 3 beds had settled. Amara heard her speak aloud to herself somewhere behind the rosemary wall. "The upper edge," Leela said. "Dart to the stake. No farther. And sage still taking. Let it take." Their voices faded. Amara looked at the eastern lip. It held a bright, quick current even at the smaller setting. She had once treated every moment between a question and its answer as unused time. Now she could feel how much local work occupied it, watching a soil edge darken, waiting for a float to settle, letting a long, shallow channel find its level. Tomas rang from the cistern, one note followed by a soft accidental clink as the bell touched the measuring rod. A few breaths later, Nico replied from Mint Bend. The central closing values agreed. Nico called uphill. "Ordinary time at the bend," Thomas answered. "Evening mark at Hearth." Amara wrote both. Central closing received. The words traveled down but did not summon either man to her. They continued their own reset. Timas checked that the float cover was seated. Nico retrieved the cedar chip from its catching screen and drained it on the wall. Those details needed doing, and neither required coordination from the divide. Leela's garden bell rang once. The east section had settled. Only the west remained. The sunset had gone from the channel surface, leaving a pale band of open sky reflected upstream. Amara could now hear the different heights of the village more clearly than she could see them. Nearby, the divide ran over stone. Halfway down, Hearth Kistern added its hollow overflow. At the lower limit of hearing, water touched something softer soil, reeds, or both. Mira's brass note rose through that layered sound. One note meant the resting pool still received. Aaron answered with one from Lavender End. After the formal patterns of the evening, the two simple strokes felt almost conversational. Amara entered the last closing values. No branch had fallen outside range during the return to ordinary allocation. The local shim worked at both test and evening depths. Household draws at the cistern and on the western shelf had occurred without breaking downstream continuity. The annual test had not merely filled an empty network. It had balanced a network while the village used it. Nico and Tomas began climbing back. Leela appeared at the eastern turn carrying a shallow herb basket against her hip. Aaron and Mira would take longer, and nobody called for them to hurry. Amara placed her palm once more on the broad stone between the three lips. It was fully cool now. The water above it approached as a common sheet met the boundaries the village had set and became three useful directions. Nothing in that division suggested that one branch mattered less because another was farther away, or that the hand at the center knew more than the hands at the ends. When the returning neighbors gathered, Amara did not read their details back as commands. She asked each for the outcome on the card, accepted the local notation that supported it, and marked the shared result. The gentle work of the final test had been less a sequence of her decisions than a period in which many good decisions held together. Leela came first, as the upper distance was shortest. Spring bowl between marks. East Gardens received their portions, all gates at evening positions. Any local change during the hold? I narrowed the sage by 1 leaf width when it reached its stake, as allowed on my card. I left rosemary open until the last signal. Amara checked the outcome, not the technique. All 3 soil marks were recorded within range. Eastern section passes. Tomas and Nico arrived together. The cistern card showed the start mark, fill mark, household draw, overflow start, half interval, and full interval. Nico's times linked Mintbend to each. The two used different handwriting and had written around one another without confusion. Central section passes, Amara said. Thomas looked at the main gates. You have not moved from here. I moved from sitting to standing several times. A vigorous test. They remained while the lower signals completed. The western branch took on its evening whisper. Far away, one bell rang, then another. Aaron's voice eventually carried from the path. Both lavender runs holding. Pool clear, Mira added. And the cup comparison was half a cup, for the record. Whose cup? Leela called. Mine, which is the only cup comparison under responsible management. Aaron and Mira climbed slowly, leaving local gates in the care of the households and growers who used them. Aaron's reed strip bore 2 wet lines nearly level with one another. The clay shim had stayed seated. Lavender End received its useful flow, and the reed resting pool took the remainder without clouding or a dry break. Western section passes, Amara said. For a moment nobody spoke. The water did. At the divide it crossed all 3 lips in the reduced evening measure, continuous and plain. Amara drew a line beneath the final column. Every branch had entered the agreed range. The coordinated test was complete. What remained was return, confirmation, and signatures. She picked up the central bell and rang the last formal signal. One long note traveled over the terraces. From the spring to the resting pool, neighbors answered it in sequence. Not because another adjustment was needed, but because their sections were finished. The group left the three-lip divide by their own routes. Leela went uphill for the spring card. Tomas and Nico descended by Hearth Kistern. Aaron took the western path, and Mira carried the used cups toward the square. Amara gathered the central bell, her pencil, and the baseline cards. She did not follow any of them. Their closing reports had already arrived, and the smell of time bread had begun to rise through the cooling lanes. By the time she reached the square, the returned cards were gathering beneath the plane tree. The annual sheet waited on a square table beneath the plane tree. Suri had brought it from the survey house and weighted its corners with 4 smooth pieces of oven brick. The sheet held a diagram simpler than Amara's wall map. Source, 3 main branches, named destinations and blank boxes for results. Around it gathered the returning participants and several neighbors who had managed individual garden gates. Leela arrived from above and placed the cloud step card in its box. Final bowl level below the upper white mark and above the lower. Settling water clear. Head gate returned to evening flow. Leela signed beside her plant-shaped notation. Thyme, rosemary, and sage all reached their stakes. No edge wash. Suri gave them each a piece of fennel roll but did not uncover the larger loaves yet. This is administrative bread, she explained. Supper bread begins after signatures. Mira came up from the lower lane with the brass bell wrapped in its cloth. Reed resting pool remained clear after the evening setting. The inlet narrowed as intended, but never broke. Aaron followed with damp clay still marking his fingertips. Lavender end passed at the test setting and at the evening setting. The shim remains seated under the lip. I wedged its outer edge and tied it to the gate cord, so it cannot wash into the run. His report settled the physical detail without handing Amara the whole responsibility. Which will be more stable without making the lip difficult to reset? She asked. The clay now in place, a fired piece roughened on both faces might last longer, but this one will hold. Then record the installed clay as the final setting. If you later make a like-for-like fired piece, treat that as ordinary maintenance, not unfinished correction. Aaron wrote the installed thickness, its tie, and its 2 validated depths on the lower card. The clay stays where it passed. Good. That was the last minor setting. No concealed correction waited in a channel bed. No one produced a gate they had adjusted without reporting. The cards returned with wet thumbprints, herb sketches, timing columns, masonry symbols, and household notes. Their surfaces looked nothing like Amara's old uniform forms. Their outcomes agreed. At Lavender End, the proven setting remained physically in place, seated, secured, and carrying the same balanced evening flow the Western team had measured. She laid them in geographic order around the annual sheet and read each closing result aloud. Cloud Step Spring, source stable, through baseline and full cycle. Eastern Gardens household independent branch allocation received by all 3 upper beds. Mint bend, timing within current seasonal range, with the faster clean bend noted for ordinary monitoring. Hearth Tistern, fill, household draw, and overflow verified under active use. Fennel reach and lavender end, final useful flows within marks after 1 local lip adjustment. Reed resting pool, continuous clear remainder at test and evening settings. Nico traced the diagram without touching the paper. Every branch. Every named branch in every allocation required by this test, Amara said. She checked the completion boxes. Source: Eastern Gardens. Central Homes. Western Gardens. Central Homes. Western Gardens. Lower settling. Signals. Evening receipt. The annual record required signatures from the coordinator and at least 1 keeper from each principal branch. Amara signed first, writing the date and the start and completion bells. Leela signed for the Eastern branch. Tomas started to sign for the Central branch. then pushed the pencil toward Suri. You explained its only interesting behavior, he said. Suri took the pencil. And I represent the determined use of water for flower. They both signed. Aaron signed for the Western branch, and Mira added her name beside the resting pool result. Nico signed the timing comparison as recorder. Amara placed the pencil at the bottom line and wrote, Annual full channel balance test complete. All household and garden allocations verified. 1 lavender end lip setting finalized locally. No further system correction required. She read it once, then put the pencil down. The practical task was finished. Suri removed the 4 oven brick weights. May I now recognize as completion with non-administrative bread? You may, Amara said. The cloth came off the basket. People began carrying cards and bells toward the survey house in 2s and 3s. Amara slid the signed annual sheet between 2 clean boards. She did not make a second copy at the square. The figures would still be there tomorrow. For a little while, the square loosened around the finished record. Siri carried the 4 pieces of oven brick back to the low wall by the bakehouse, then folded the administrative cloth into a small square and tucked it beneath the bread basket. Tomas turned the pencil once between his fingers before setting it beside the boards, where it no longer belonged to any particular branch. The gestures were ordinary and unhurried. Nothing waited behind them. Leela sat on the rim of the dry planter and finished the piece of fennel roll Suri had given her. Aaron washed the last pale trace of clay from his fingertips at the basin. Mira poured the unused water from the field cups around the roots of the plane tree, moving from one side to the other because the earth there was dusty. Nobody called these things part of the test. The bells lay together in their cloths. Without distance between them, they looked smaller than they had sounded across the terraces. The plain iron cup rested against the wooden-handled bell. The brass one caught a narrow reflection of the western sky. Their replies had crossed walls, gardens, roofs, and bends that no one person could see at once. Now they needed only to be put away. Nico picked up one end of the clean boards. Amara took the other. Around them, conversation had already changed its shape. Mira asked Leela whether the late time would be ready for cutting in 2 days. Thomas wanted to know who had moved the long bench under the fig tree. Suri answered that the bench had moved because 6 people had carried it, which was the most reliable known cause of a bench changing location. They started toward the survey house at a pace slow enough to keep the signed sheet level. The lane had lost its afternoon glare. Window ledges held shallow bands of blue shadow, and the white walls gave back the day's warmth through Amara's sleeve when the boards brought her close to them. Below the houses, water continued in several notes at once. No note asked them to turn aside. The lane to the survey house had grown blue by the time Amara and Nico carried the boards inside. The room kept the last of the day's warmth, though the sill beneath the bells was cold. They returned each bell to its place. Dark wooden handle, plain iron cup, red cord, small brass, and the others between them. Their notes were finished for the year. Nico stacked the branch cards beside the annual record. He aligned their bottom edges, considered the uneven sides, and left them uneven. They will not fit neatly in the old envelope, he said. We can use the wider folder. The one for repair sketches? These are sketches of how the system worked. He found the folder and tied it with soft blue cord. Amara wrote the episode's date only, the date, not a summary on its outer flap. The sign sheet went in front, Amara's coordinator card behind it, and the 6 local cards behind that. No loose paper remained on the table. They washed the cups and the measuring strip in the little basin. Nico wiped the cedar timing chip and set it on the window ledge to dry. Amara sharpened the pencil with 3 turns of a small knife, stopped before the point became perfect, and returned it to the jar. Outside, voices had begun to gather beneath the plane tree. They were quieter than the working calls that had crossed the terraces. A bench scraped once. Cups touched the tabletop. Suri laughed at something Thomas said, and the sound softened as someone opened the bakehouse door. "Will you check the listening channel before we go?" Nico asked. Amara heard no dependence in the question. He was looking at the narrow water beside the house because it was pleasant, not because the signed record had failed to convince him. "We can listen to it," she said. They stood at the back threshold. The small channel received a thread from the central branch and carried it past a row of flat stones before returning it downhill. Its note was clear and low. A moth hovered over one reflected patch of sky, touched nothing, and moved into the mint leaves. Nico listened for a few breaths. "It sounds ordinary." "Yes, that seems like a good result." He went ahead to the square. Amara closed the survey house door but did not latch the shutters. Night air could pass through the room and dry the damp corners of the cards. At the lower end of the return lane, Amara slowed. SOH Oak H4E07H03 start. Amara reached a fork where she could inspect 3 gates and instead turned towards supper. The eastern path would have shown her Leela's evening setting among the rosemary. The central steps led to the cistern float, and the western stair offered a last view of the adjusted lip above Lavender End. All 3 branch teams had already returned their cards. Every final reading lay inside its agreed range. Every household and garden allocation had been confirmed, and the annual record was signed complete. She left the gates to the neighbors who had set them. From uphill came the bright thread of cloud-step water crossing the upper stones. The central run answered under the lane, fuller and more hollow near Hearth Tistern. Far below, the western branch whispered through fennel and lavender before entering the reeds. No bell interrupted them. The sounds overlapped without a break. Amara took the path to the square. Behind her, the uninterrupted water continued through all 3 branches, confirming the completed test as she walked away. Nifricas 4E07 H3E. She did not hurry. Cooling limestone gave back the warmth it had held all afternoon when her hand brushed the wall beside the path. The top stones were still faintly warm and the shaded joints were cool. Lavender scent rose from below, no longer sharp with sun. It mingled with bread, thyme, and the green smell of water moving under leaves. At the square, no one had arranged a formal meal. The annual sheet was already gone, and the table beneath the plane tree had become an ordinary supper table. Suri had torn the thyme loaves into broad pieces. Mira poured mint and lemon balm tea from one jar and cool spring water from the other. Tomas cut the cheese with the same small knife he used for clay string, after cleaning it under Suri's direct supervision. Amara sat between Leela and Aaron. Someone passed her bread before she asked. The crust cracked under her fingers, and the inside released warm thyme and a little steam. "The eastern rosemary will want a shorter turn tomorrow," Leela said, spreading herb oil on her bread. "Not because of the test, because it drank well today." "You know its range," Amara replied. Leela glanced at her. "I do." That was all they said about the eastern branch. Across the table, Aaron mentioned that a fired shim might someday make a durable like-for-like replacement. Thomas suggested 2 crossing grooves so it would hold without sticking. They compared the likely texture of 2 local clays, but there was no corrective work waiting for morning. Neither asked Amara to choose between them. After a while, their discussion wandered toward a cracked flower pot, then toward whether the pot's owner had planted basil in it precisely because the crack provided drainage. "It is possible to call almost any crack a feature after adding basil," Mira observed. Suri handed her cheese. That sentence explains half the village. Nico had brought the blue bucket to the edge of the square. It rested upside down near the cistern steps, a plain object again. He told Leela how its delayed fill had crossed his first timing report. "I thought 2 wrong numbers had found each other," he said, "but one number was only early in the story and the other had a bucket attached." Leela nodded as if this were a useful way to understand both channels and neighbors. Most numbers improve when you learn what they were doing. Amara ate the bread slowly enough to taste the fennel seed in its crust. During previous annual tests, supper had often become another review. She would unfold the map between plates, compare the figures while everyone remembered them, and circle tasks for morning. Tonight the record was stored. No corrective task waited for daylight. The plane leaves shifted overhead. Their dark shapes crossed the lamplight on the table. Beyond the square wall, hearth cistern overflowed with a low, rounded note. Now and then a household pipe sounded briefly as someone filled a night pitcher. The cistern level accommodated the draws and continued toward the gardens. Suri poured Amara more water. Did the system pass? You signed the sheet. I signed for a bucket and a branch. I am asking whether the person who sat at the middle believes the whole thing passed. Amara looked around the table. Leela was listening to Mira describe a tea blend. Thomas turned a fennel roll over in search of the crispest side. Aaron rubbed a bit of dried clay from his cuff. Nico had stopped talking about timings and was showing Suri how the cedar chip spun when released too close to a channel wall. It passed, Amara said. And did you inspect every gate? No. Suri drank from her cup. Then perhaps next year we can begin supper before midnight with no sense of reckless innovation. It is not yet fully dark. We should not become proud. The conversation thinned naturally as people ate. No one filled the quieter spaces simply because they had opened. The sounds beyond the table came forward. A broom on paving at the far side of the square, an evening insect beneath the cistern wall. Water slipping through the overflow notch, a cup set down on wood. Someone at the end of the table began peeling a late pear with a little horn-handled knife. The skin came away in one wavering green ribbon. When it broke, Mira divided the fruit into narrow pieces and passed the plate without asking who wanted one. Amara took a slice. It was cool, faintly grainy, and sweeter near the peel. The plate traveled around the table and returned with a single piece left for Suri. A pair of children crossed the upper edge of the square carrying the blue bucket between them. It was empty now and bumped softly against each of their knees. They had used it to gather fallen plane leaves, though most of the leaves escaped whenever they tried to tip them into a heap. Suri watched one yellow leaf sail back across the paving and made no suggestion about a better method. The children followed it, whispering as though the leaf might hear them. Beyond the awning, the reflected sunset withdrew from the cistern wall by slow degrees. Gold became rose. Rose became a pale strip of gray, and then the stone held only the small amber lamps from the square. Amara did not notice the exact moment of change. She noticed afterward that everyone's faces had softened into the same low light. Leela leaned back against the trunk of the plane tree. The spring bell sounded very near from up there, she said. I knew it must be carrying all the way down, but it felt as if I were ringing for the bowl and the two of us. At Lavender End, it sounded like a spoon dropped in another street, Aaron said. A dignified spoon, Thomas reminded him. They smiled, and the subject passed. No one reconstructed the order of the replies. The bells were already on their shelf, and the evening had no need to perform itself again. Leela broke the last fennel roll in half and gave one piece to Amara for the uphill walk. I am walking downhill. Then it will be less strenuous bread. Amara wrapped it in a corner of cloth. The lamps burned lower. One by one, neighbors carried cups to the basin and left by the lanes nearest their homes. Aaron went west with Thomas, still speaking quietly about clay. Mira took the tea jars to her house across the square. Nico and Leela climbed toward the herb terraces, their footsteps fading above the plane tree. Suri folded the bread cloth and shook crumbs into her palm. There is a heel left. Keep it for morning. A sensible allocation. Together they moved to the bench under the awning. Amara carried the cups inside the bakehouse while Suri covered the cheese. The ovens had cooled, but their bricks still held a deep, dry warmth. A faint dusting of flour lay on the kneading trough that had caused the evening's only apparent discrepancy. Its clean wood smelled of grain and water. They did not discuss the test again. When the square was set in order, Surrey took the north lane, and Amara took the lower path toward home. The village walls had turned pale blue under the first stars. Small lamps glowed behind shutters. From an open courtyard came the soft clink of someone washing supper dishes. From another, the murmur of a story already halfway told. Amara passed Hearth Kistern without climbing its steps. She could hear the overflow. That was enough. At the next bend, the central channel divided into smaller household runs. One slipped beneath a stone cover and emerged beside a fig tree. Another traced the outer wall of a quiet courtyard. Their notes were thinner than the water at the three-lip divide, but they belonged to the same unbroken evening sound. She followed it without measuring. The lane descended in shallow steps whose centers had been polished by generations of feet. Amara knew where the third step leaned and where the seventh held a little coolness after sunset. She let her pace find them without looking down. The wrapped bread in her hand gave off a last trace of fennel whenever the cloth moved. At a courtyard opening, an old woman sat combing her hair beside a lamp. She lifted 2 fingers in greeting, and Amara answered with the hand that held the bread. Neither spoke. From inside the house came the rustle of bedding shaken out for the night. A shutter settled into place across the lane, then another farther below, each sound separate from the water and briefly held within it. The fork toward the eastern gates appeared between 2 walls. Amara passed it. The narrow stair to the cistern's lower ledge appeared after the fig tree. She passed that as well. When the western viewing step opened beside the lane, she kept to the worn center of the path. Reflected lamplight moved along the channel covers at her side, appearing in one gap and vanishing beneath the next stone. There was relief in not turning, but it was not the relief of escaping unfinished work. It was the quieter ease of knowing where the work now rested. In Leela's evening turn, Thomas and Surrey's household marks, Nico's timing notes, Aaron's settled clay, Mira's clear pool report, and all the small local judgments that had returned on cards in different hands. Amara did not need to gather those hands into her own in order for them to remain connected. The path crossed above Fennel Reach, where the long, shallow run made almost no noise over its smooth bed. Amara heard it only when a stem touched the surface and tapped lightly against the wall. Farther down, Lavender End gave back a softer whisper. The terraces were mostly dark, their rows suggested by scent, fennel's green sweetness, lavender cooling in the night, a trace of sage where the air rose from the east. No lamp moved among the gates. No one was checking after the check. Amara reached the low wall above the sea path and paused. Reflected starlight trembled in the narrow western channel. It passed the branch toward the old purple bed, crossed the straight run beside it, and went on beyond her view. She did not step down to compare the two. Aaron's wet marks were in the folder. The lavender had received its share. The resting pool inlet was continuous. Below, reeds shifted in the evening breeze. Their dry leaves made a hush around the quieter sound of water settling among their roots. Amara continued toward her house. She carried no measuring rod and no cards, only the wrapped half-roll Leela had given her. Her hands smelled faintly of cool limestone, mint tea, and bread. At her gate, she could still distinguish the network if she chose. Spring water high on the slope, the central hollow near the cistern, the long western thread at the lower terraces. Yet as she listened, the parts joined. Distant voices had faded. The last bell had long since stopped. What remained was one continuous evening murmur traveling from Cloud Step Spring through the divide, past homes and herbs to the reeds below. The sound did not ask to be inspected. Amara opened her gate, went inside, and left the balanced water to the many hands that knew its branches.